This second talk, based on some lectures I gave on economic anthropology for first-year undergraduates at Cambridge in 2004, is, as the other talks, very simplified, just trying to give the basic overview, and the details will have to be filled in. So I oversimplify many things and give a very simple model which you may disagree with, but at least it should give some idea of the most simple forms of the field. The lecture here is about property and stratification. As I explained in the first lecture, there are four main ways of approaching economics. The 18th century question of how you produce wealth, the 19th century one of how you distribute wealth, the 20th century one of how you exchange wealth, and the 21st of how you consume wealth. In this one I'm dealing with the 19th century framework of how you distribute wealth, private property and equality and inequality. So what is property? And what do people think it is? A book called Notes and Queries in Anthropology defines it as follows. Ownership is best defined as the sum total of rights which various persons or groups of persons have over things. The things thus owned are property. Property thus defined in terms of the relations of persons to things. We tend to think of property as a thing. We say, this is my property, holding up a cricket bat or whatever it is. It isn't. The cricket bat isn't the property. It's the relationship I have between myself, that object, and you, another person. You can't really have property on your own. Robinson Crusoe on his island had no property until Man Friday turned up, because everything was just his. It's only in relation to other people that you have rights in things. What are these rights that you have in things? Well, they're the rights to use things, to use the cricket bat, the rights to control the use or disposal of the property by others. You can say, I don't want you to use that cricket bat tomorrow, but you can use it the next day, and so on. The rights to derive an income or other benefit from the use of property, and you can say you can have it next day, but you have to pay me some money. Rights to be described as a titular owner of property. You just say, it's my cricket bat, but that's it, that's all, I'm not going to ever use it. Several different types of rights of this kind can be had over an object. And it's important to realize that the object doesn't have to be a thing, a physical thing, a material thing like a cricket bat. The Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences has a rather nice definition of the different kinds of property you might have. Property, it says, is a euphonious, that means a nice sounding word, collection of letters, P-R-O-P-E-R-T-Y and so on, which serves as a general term for the miscellany, that's different kinds of equities, that is rights, that persons hold in a commonwealth within a society. A coin, a lance, a tapestry, a monastic vow, here you've got something immaterial, a yoke of oxen, a female slave, an award of alimony, a home, a first mortgage, a railroad system, a preferred list, and a right of contract are all to be discovered within this Catholic category, this wide category. So the questions we have to ask are, what is the nature of property? Who holds it? How is it transmitted? And what effects do different property systems have on the world? Alongside property is the allied question of stratification, that is, how wealth is distributed between different groups in a society. And here there are two major, very different views of the basic nature of human societies. One is that we are by birth born unequal, that men and women, free people, slaves, upper caste people, lower caste people, are by their very birth unequal. It may be written on their brows or through what they've done in a former life, but we are not born equal into this world. That is one view, and it's a very widespread view. In fact, it's the most widespread view in history by far. The other, which is much more restricted, is that we are born equal, even if we may end up unequal in terms of our wealth. And this is now, of course, the dominant world ideology, but it's only very recently so, in the last 100 or 150 years, that it's become the dominant world ideology. Equality, in fact, now has become not merely a point of view, but a form of religion. Contrasting America, which was almost from its early settlement taken the view that human beings are born equal, setting on one side slavery, of course, and the Japanese, the anthropologist Ruth Benedict wrote that equality is the highest, most moral American basis for hopes for a better world. We spread equality, and that is what's the basic message. As someone wrote in the Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences under equality, a man called Kristol, Kristol, it is a distinguishing characteristic of the modern age that equality should be not merely an abstract idea, but also a politically aggressive idea. Every inequality is on the defensive, must prove itself against the imputation of injustice and unnaturalness. We know this in relation to democracy. Democracy must be spread, and everything that is not democracy must justify itself. But it's also the case of equality, which is part, of course, of democracy. Political equality is democracy. Or as Dumont, D-U-M-O-N-T, writes, "For us, every man is in principle an embodiment of humanity at large, and as such he is equal to every other man and free." Finally, one could quote perhaps the most perceptive modern writer on equality, George Orwell, who wrote that the whole English-speaking world is haunted by the idea of human equality. And though it would be simply a lie to say that either we or the Americans have ever acted up to our professions, still the idea is there, and it is capable of one day becoming a reality. So, what is the real human nature? Are we Homo hierarchicus, as Dumont calls us, hierarchical species, or Homo equalis, an equal at birth species? I'll look at this by looking at the four major types of economic system that I outlined in the first talk, that is hunter-gatherer, tribesmen, peasants and industrial societies. So let's look first at hunter-gatherers and the immediate return kind of hunter-gatherers that I described, who go out, hunt, gather and then consume what they gather. In these societies, famous examples are the Hadza, the Kung, the Naiken. The spellings will be beside this lecture. There was very considerable equality in every sense. There was equality between men and women, parents and children, the more successful and the less successful. This was what Marshall Sahlins calls the original affluent society. Affluent not only because means and ends were conjoined, you could more or less got whatever you wanted out of life. You go and hunt and gather what you needed, but also because there was no sense of what's called relative deprivation. You didn't feel, oh, there's someone over there who's better off than me, who's got a better lifestyle, who's less sick than me, and so on. There is little cause for envy, which is one of the great sources of unhappiness. So it's the original affluent society in that sense. This world approximates most closely to what many of us in many societies think of as utopia, which we find in great myths of the origin of the world. For example, the Garden of Eden, as a medieval saying had it, when Adam delved and Eve span, who then was the gentleman? In other words, there was no inequality. In Rousseau's vision, also, you find the idea of the natural equality of humankind. Everyone is born equal, though subsequently we become unequal. And you find it in the other great vision, the 19th century vision of Karl Marx, that in primitive societies people are equal, and then they have become unequal. And there is some grounds for thinking that in relation to immediate return hunters and gatherers. There was no class there, obviously, no caste, barely perceptible ranking. The ethic was one of sharing. And so for 50,000 or so years, man could be, and that included women, could be considered to be naturally equal, in that their original state was one where you didn't have inherited birth differences. Of course, it's a little more complex than this in practice, because, as we will see, there is some idea of private property and private territories, and therefore some people have advantages over others, and sometimes men are a little more advantageous over women, and so on. Because these societies are definitely not communist in the full Marxist sense. They're not communist utopias. As the great American anthropologist Robert Lowie, L-O-W-I-E, described, in these societies characteristic that there are forms of privatized property. It isn't a communist utopia. For example, in the Torres Straits, as he describes, there was very highly individualized private property, and this is a society off the north coast of Australia. Every rock and waterhole had its owner, the only common piece of common land being the village street. Or again, the Andaman Islands, which have come to the world attention sadly as I give this lecture through the tsunami which has swamped them. In the Andaman Islands, magic, songs and legends are private property. I quote Lowie again, a song that has been received with applause may be repeated by request at lesser gatherings, but irrespective of its popularity, no one dare sing it except the composer themselves. Now, this is an example of immaterial property, as I mentioned. It's a song, it's not something you can pick up in your hands, but you have property rights in it. Or among another group, when a woman sells an incantation, she must promise that she gives it up entirely and that the buyer will become the only possessor of its mysterious power. So magical spells can be private property, and they are in many of these societies. Likewise, certain carvings are not to be copied. So even in very, very simple societies, certain things are privatized. But in general, it's roughly the case that most of the property is in intangible things, immaterial things, songs, spells, secret knowledge, and so on, rather than material things, where people are fairly equal. The reasons for this lie in the absences. There's no real way to store inequality and pass it on. There's no money system, no banks. Land is not valuable in itself. There are no advanced technologies of war or wealth which make it possible to institute inequality between groups. And even the kinship system, which is very flexible, is atomistic and flexible, and you can join a group and leave a group. So people find it difficult to establish permanent superiority, which they can hand on to the next generation. In the delayed return hunters and gatherers, those who store wealth for a while, for instance, they hunt salmon and then they keep the salmon frozen or whatever, there's the beginnings of some form of instituted inequality, the foreshadowing of ranks. They're not hand-to-mouth societies, and societies such as those who live in the northwest coast of America, the Indians with their salmon and deer cultures, had surpluses which they stored and produced temporary inequalities at least. The goods so saved, meat, fish oil, nuts, berries, are the property of a person or a family. And this led to the emergence of some forms of ranking, political ranking of chiefs and commoners, competitions between wealthy and poorer people. Since, however, the ethic is still one of distribution and consumption rather than trying to save in a savings account, then and exchanging wealth and displaying wealth, You have the development of what's called the potlatch culture, that's P-O-T-L-A-T-C-H, that is competitive giving against each other, and I'll talk about later, and the beginnings of big men cultures, that is, some people are known to be wealthier than other people. So while there isn't a long-term institutionalization of ranks, you can't talk about classes or castes or anything like that, there is the beginnings of economic differentiation. The next major grouping, which I've broken civilizations into, are tribal societies. And first of all, I'll talk about the pastoral tribal societies, those who keep animals. Of course, there are different types of pastoralism depending on whether you keep cows, reindeer, camels, sheep, and so on. But what seems to be common to all of them is that this kind of mode of production, that is keeping animals, inhibits the development of ranks in a very serious form. You don't tend to have classes and castes in such societies. There are several features of the property system that can be noted about these places. Firstly, property is only residually held by an individual. You tend not to have your own personal cows or sheep or reindeer, or even a small family group. It tends to be owned by a larger grouping of an extended kinship unit, a tribal segment. The unit of ownership is a group of related kin, a lineage or a clan. So beyond some privatized property, some ornaments you might wear or household furnishings, there's little sense really talking much about private property in these societies. Secondly, the major form of property is a mixture of animals and people. You have property in animals, but you also have property in other people. Women are a major form of property. It sounds odd to us to say that, but they are in these societies. Their labour, their hard work, and also the fact that they produce children, their reproductive property or rights in them, are famously property and are exchanged between groups. Much of the marriage negotiations and so on are concerned with sending women back and forth between groups because they are valuable property. It's rights in people that are the main concern. Women for their reproductive and labour value, men for their ability in war and producing crops and so on, or looking after animals. For ultimately, whether a group survives or is wiped out depends on the social relationships you have and in investments in people as well as animals. It's not what you have in these societies, but, as we say, who you know. That's important. Finally, the distribution of property, that is the number of animals and other good things, is fairly even. You have a kind of threshold. When a group begins to build up herds, they tend then either to be attacked by other groups, or the herds get too big really to manage on a certain ecological landscape, and so they get subdivided. So a very notable feature of pastoral nomads is how there's a very strong pressure against the development of property inequalities. The classic monographs on such peoples, Evans Pritchard on the Nuer and other East African monographs, work on the Bedouins, on reindeer herders and so on, shows them to be fiercely egalitarian. The bands are constantly, or the groups are constantly fighting each other to maintain equality between them. And a lot of the feuding is concerned with stopping any particular group getting too big for its boots. The main principles of ranking here, therefore, are not on terms of wealth, but in terms of sex and age. Men are different from women, and the older different from the younger age groups. So you have an age grade societies which people move through. Again, it's tempting to see the reason behind this absence of instituted inequalities as the mode of production. That basically the law of diminishing marginal returns, that is, the law whereby if you're producing in a certain way, at a certain point putting in more effort doesn't get you more returns. and that applies to herding animals to a large extent. The herds have a natural upper limit, and so it's very difficult for someone to become a landlord, so to speak, in these societies. The other major form of tribal society, the horticulturalists, those who gain livelihood through tending crops, again you see an incipient, the beginnings of inequalities. So here you have the delayed return hunter-gatherers phenomenon of beginnings of big men societies more manifest, because here now you're producing quite considerable surpluses. You're not just hunting and gathering, but you're actually making wealth, and therefore you have, through strategic alliances, through cunning and so on, a person can in their lifetime become a big man. They can control quite large amounts of wealth through organizing other people. Surpluses which it's difficult to conceal or move and difficult to transmit between the generations, but make you for a time superior over other people. Wealth is produced by human labor, and the group is defended by men and increased by the fertility of women. These societies tend to be, as are the pastoral societies, ones based on the inheritance of group membership through males, but also sometimes through females. And again, the really important thing is a mixture of some rights in the landscape, but also who you know, your kinship and other relations, which allows you to become wealthy. It's also at this stage that you begin to get chiefs and commoners, so you're beginning to get chieftainships, which are instituted differences, and also you have the beginnings of the differences between slaves and free people, slaves often captured in warfare and elsewhere. And very conspicuous displays of wealth differences occur in these societies. This is the big men complexes, for instance, of New Guinea. And what you do is you manipulate your relationships and make people indebted to you through gifts and exchanges, and then you can call this in on certain occasions. But in a sense, this is only temporary differences. Each generation starts anew. It reminds me of the game of marbles, which I used to play at school, where at the beginning of each season you would start with a few marbles, and through the season you would accumulate more and more marbles, and some people were known to be very good and had huge, great bags holding lots of marbles, but then at the end of the year they would stand on a high place and throw them all away, potlatch them, distribute them, gain prestige from giving them all away, and then the next marble season they'd start again. And so it is with a big man. Their children tend not to be big men unless they're capable and can continue this. Thus there is differential prestige between people, but not differential class, caste and estate. Up to this point, these four systems, or two main systems subdivided into two, constitute most of man's life on Earth until 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. And in these societies, basically humans are born equal, homo equalis. Legally and in other ways, humans are born equal, even if there are small instituted inequalities in each generation. The only exception lies really in slavery in some Swidden societies and the idea of big men to a certain extent. We now move to agrarian civilizations, those which are based what we might call peasant societies. About 5,000 years ago, a number of technological and organizational developments allowed the emergence of a new set of opportunities, which we roughly can call peasant civilizations. Among the most important of these, which affect the distribution of wealth enormously, is the possibility of storing and transferring wealth, money, writing, new forms of weapon to guard wealth, and new ways of instituting this in cities and states. So combined with greater wealth produced by new technologies such as ploughs and animal traction and wheels, you have suddenly human beings, only 5,000-6,000 years ago, can suddenly generate and then carve up much greater amounts of wealth. This led into what one sees over that long period from 5,000 years ago up till very recently in India, China, South America and so on, civilizations which dominated the globe and which had substantial wealth, surpluses and a complex division of labour which led to great inequalities. These kinds of agrarian societies had different ways of instituting property and wealth, and it's worth dividing them up and differentiating them somewhat. You can firstly have what are called the classical peasantries or the slave peasantries. In terms of property, the ownership is no longer based on kin groupings as in previous forms, but now is held in another way, which is not private property, but ultimately land held by the state or those who are powerful in the state. They themselves tend to hold it as representatives and heads of families, and their rights of disposal are limited, so it's not privatized property, but it's not what it was before. Furthermore, property still has a heavy emphasis on rights in people as things, and that is what basically slavery is about. Your great property is not just in inanimate objects or even in livestock, but in human beings. The ancient, as it's sometimes also called, or slave mode of production, where the basic division is between the free owners of slaves and the unfree, is very, very widespread and is the basis of many of the great classical civilization in South America, and Egypt and Syria, the Aztecs, the Incas, Greece, and to a certain extent China might fit within this term. There are free citizens, encompassing those who can read and write and live in cities, and the rulers, and the unfree, the slaves. The basic premise here, of course, has switched entirely from the earlier one of people are born equal to one where people are not born equal. Man is naturally unequal. If you look in classical Greek theory, social theory and so on, you find the premise of inequality. That is the basic premise of Greek political philosophy. Human beings are not born equal. And to a certain extent you find that in China with a great division between the literate and the peasants, though slavery is not in the same form. Slaves have become a factor of production. They are a goods, a chattel, a thing you dispose of, which is to be used like any other animal, a beast of burden. They can be bought, they can be sold, they can be killed or maimed depending on their master's need. This, of course, continued as a main form of production until very recently. Indeed, it's still prevalent in too many parts of the world now. But certainly in America, for instance, it continued until the middle of the 19th century with the emancipation of the slaves. That's one of the great forms. The second is the caste system. Caste is defined by the anthropologist Kroeber as an endogamous, that means marrying within the group, and hereditary subdivision of an ethnic unit, occupying a position of superior or inferior rank or social esteem in comparison with other such divisions. Here are a few general features of caste systems. Caste comes from the Portuguese word to do with sexual divisions, and therefore it's to do with blood as well and birth as well as economic difference. Basically, nearly all caste systems, in fact probably all caste systems, are divided into four main groups. There are three ruling groups, or three groups which are clean and free. These are the rulers, Kshatriya in Indian, the Brahmins, the priests, the Vaishya, the common folk, farmers and merchants. And those are the white, using the colour terminology, and the free groupings in India. And then there are the black people, the Sudra, who are the unclean, not slaves, but as they're called in that area, untouchable. You mustn't touch them. The odd feature about caste, which is really central to it, is that it's not merely a matter of who you can marry or not marry, or who you can eat with or not eat with, and differences of wealth, but it's a system which grades people on their purity, their ritual purity, their closeness to God, so to speak, rather than their wealth or their power. And the system is hierarchical, not in the sense of layers like strata in geology or layers of a cake, just layers as in our class system, but hierarchical because it's all to do with hierarchy, which in its strict sense means the relations between groups. It's to do with the interconnections between groups. It's what's known as an organic metaphor. That is, it's like organs of a body. So each caste in the Indian caste system is thought of as a part of a whole body and only has sense in relation to that body. For instance, one part is the head, another are the arms and legs and stomach and so on. So basically the head or the arms would have no meaning without being related to other parts of the body. And an individual caste is only meaningful in relationship to another caste. The system, of course, is to be found most famously in the Indian subcontinent, and it's disputed as to whether you should really use the term caste elsewhere. For instance, in the black-white relations in apartheid Africa or southern states of America traditionally, or, for instance, in the fact that there is an untouchable group in Japan, concealed and not widely known, called the Brahmin, who are supposed to have been abolished now. Whether you can talk about them as a caste or not, or the blacks in South Africa in the early part of the 20th century is a moot point. It sort of loses its meaning to a certain extent once it goes outside India, but it's a useful term. In this system, the property or assets are owned usually by small groups, by a village community, for instance, or a subcaste. And the mode of production is this subgroup or domestic family working together. A person born into such a society automatically tends to have equal shares in the assets of that family or group, or the basic group, though, of course, there are differentiations between men and women's property is usually of a different kind. So caste is the major second system that one should look at. The caste system was based in a way on a functional division between four major activities: the warriors, the priests, the merchants and peasants together, and then the others. And the other great system of agrarian societies, apart from caste and slavery, is one based on functional division of orders, again, which you may call an estate-based system. Different estates, not in the sense of owning a particular property, but the estate into which you're born. And these kinds of societies, non-slave, non-caste, but estate orders, are the residuary. It's tempting to lump them all together, to treat medieval Europe and early modern Europe as one, alongside China or Turkey or something, but in fact there are many different forms within this, and it's quite useful to divide them into three major forms of non-caste societies, which you might call patrimonial societies, which encompass Islam and China and Russia and Eastern Europe perhaps; classic feudalism, which encompasses much of Western Europe; and centralized feudalism, which is really England and Japan, to a certain extent Holland and Scandinavia. Let's have a look at each of these. The patrimonial systems, this is the ones which have also sometimes been termed Oriental despotism, for instance by Wittfogel, that's Wittfogel, or absolutist systems, were distinguished by Max Weber as one of his ideal types of society. Ideal in the sense of a model of system, simplified model. His idea is described as follows. Weber used the term to refer to any type of government that is organized as a more or less direct extension of the royal household. Officials originate as household servants and remain personal dependents of the ruler as long as patrimonialism remains intact. So the Turkish system is a very good example of that. Second main form is what you might call classic feudalism. That is what many people, when they say feudalism, mean. This is one where your relations are not based on being members of the royal household, but a fealty, a relationship of contract, of an oath, of fealty or allegiance between the ruler and the vassals. Here you have independent, self-equipped warriors who exercise the authority of government in more or less autonomous fashion. This is how Weber describes them, on the basis of lands which have been granted to them. This is the system which, for instance, has been well documented for Western Europe, and it started with what Mark Bloch, B-L-O-C-H, called the dissolution of the state feudalism after the Roman collapse. Then Europe was filled with small bands of warriors who owed allegiance and fealty to their leader, and he gave them grants of land, and this built up into the feudal system. It's basically a contractual, I give you the land, you give me your fealty, flexible system. You can renounce this if you want, which emerged after about the 6th, 7th century in Europe as Rome's power collapsed, and it lasted until about the 13th century. And then it tended to move towards a sort of intermediate system which you could almost call caste-like, that is, nobility, clergy, bourgeoisie and peasantry, four orders again, who shouldn't intermarry with each other and are born unequal, sort of caste-like system throughout much of Europe. The final main system is centralized feudalism. There are two main cases, one is England and one is Japan. In each there are certain features about them. They have very large middling groups who are neither the elite nor the serfs, consisting of townsmen, craftsmen, wealthy farmers, yeomen in England, and so on. And so they don't quite fit into the rigid distinction between a huge group of illiterate peasants and a small group of rulers that you find in other estate societies. Inheritance is by a peculiar principle of primogeniture, firstborn, which forces younger children to move out because they don't have automatic rights into land. This is thought to be necessary for a certain kind of military order. But both Japan and England are the two great cases of primogeniture. One firstborn child or one child inherits most of the estate. The absence of a blood nobility, you can, in many cases in England and so on, you can buy your way into the nobility if you have enough wealth. The absence of a proper peasantry, you don't seem to have peasants in the same sort of way, people tied to the land and producing and consuming in little domestic units in the same way that you tend to get later in France and Italy and Spain. A widespread and diffused literacy, no real gap between the literate and the illiterate in the same way as in most peasant societies. And a good deal of social mobility, people able to move up. You're not stuck as a peasant all your life. You can move up into the towns and even up into the higher classes if you're lucky or your children are lucky. And the balance between the power and the periphery is different, and this is why you call it centralized feudalism. In classic feudalism, in the dissolution of the state, there is no centre holding anything together until it's later revived. But in this system, the state is always very powerful, and from Anglo-Saxon times onwards, England had a very powerful centralised system with a lot of sub-delegation. So this strange sort of centralised system is the one that gradually evolved and later gave birth to the first modern capitalist society, England, and to its successor, America, which evolved out of that strange long arch, as E.P. Thompson calls it, between about the 12th and the 18th century, of an evolution towards a different kind of agrarian civilization. Here, it's neither entirely Homo hierarchicus, entirely birth inequality. There's no innate birth inequalities, or very few. But on the other hand, it's a very ranked society, and everyone is very self-conscious about their differences of rank, which is a foreshadowing and leads almost imperceptibly into the last system I want to talk about, which are class societies. Class societies can be again divided into two major forms: the Western case, capitalist societies, and the communist. So let's start with the Western case. One feature in common as between all those sorts of societies I've been talking about previously, that is, those state societies, whether based on caste or state orderings, is that they're mainly concerned with prestige, on status, on birth status, on the position you are when you are born. Status groups, which are organized on occupational lines. With the emergence of a far more powerful technology, i.e. the Industrial Revolution, where machines begin to replace human beings, a new form of stratification, unknown in the world, developed. It moves away from an organic metaphor, from the idea that, as I mentioned, of parts of the body being in relation to each other, to a mechanical or geological stratification, layers of a cake or layers of landscape in geology. And so you still get inequalities, but it's of a different kind. It's not based on birth, and it's not based on ritual purity. So you get a peculiar situation in our modern world, as de Tocqueville points out. You get a move towards greater equality. You get the idea that men are born equal. On the other hand, you get growing inequality in actual life experiences. As Marx saw, you get the immiseration and inequality of the working classes and the other classes. So you get growing equality of expectation and ideology, and de facto, in practice, often growing inequalities. So there's clearly a contradiction within the system. An absolute premise that men, and increasingly women, are born equal and free, including the equality of opportunity. They're supposed to have a level playing field, they're supposed to be able to compete equally. Yet somehow at the end, as many people, including George Orwell, have pointed out to us, although all humans are now supposedly equal, some are definitely more equal than others. So you get a pyramid with a few very, very rich and downwards and a broad base, but it's not supposed to be based on birth. It's based on achievement and education and so on, though in practice, of course, there are great advantages to being born in a well-funded family. As for property, in this system there's a strange contradiction. On the one hand, private property is instituted. People can own almost everything they want individually, not as a family. So private property is a central feature, and at the extreme, a rich old lady can disinherit all her heirs and leave all her property to a dog's home. In practice, however, the sphere in which you can act in your private property is quite limited, because there is so much property and so much of it is owned by larger organizations, the state, colleges, building societies, firms, whatever, that you find that in fact much of what you need is not owned by you. So transport, medicine, law, policing, education, housing is largely owned by bodies larger than the individual. So you pretend that you're very individualistic and you are very wealthy and you can do what you like with your life. In practice, if you look at and examine your own day, almost everything you do has been actually paid for, or at least is owned by someone else. This paradox is reversed in communism, where the pretense is that everything is held in common, no one has any private property at all. In practice, as we know from the corruptions of the later part of communism, in practice some people own a great deal privately and some a very small amount. So let's turn to that last form very briefly at the end. Basically, Marx and his disciples clearly saw that property and stratification were linked. If you can abolish private property, they thought, then you could abolish inequalities. And that's what they set out to do. The theory was based on the central concept that what determined life was not the forces of production, that is, as in the 18th century idea, that is, how you produce wealth, but the relations of production, how you were related to wealth. So classes, for example, were about the distribution of the ownership of the means of production. It sounded a good idea at the time and was entered in with the best of motives in many cases as trying to engineer a freer and more equal world. But the communist experiment has been tried in two massive and expensive cases, the Soviet Union and China, and to a certain extent in Pol Pot's experiment. In both of the big cases, for reasons which I'm sure some of you are aware of, it basically failed. While in law property was abolished, private property was abolished, in practice, in the wider sense, it could not be abolished. Rights and privileges flourished, even if on the surface some things were equal. As Orwell famously put it, and I've already alluded to, all men were equal, but some were more equal than others. And instead of the state withering away as it was supposed to do, it became more and more of a huge apparatus. And in the end, it failed ultimately because it didn't generate enough wealth. As an economic system, it didn't seem to work. So, to end the future, the egalitarian thrusts of capitalism, which really emerged in the early part of the 19th century, as Tocqueville documented it, is not easy to maintain. The great vanguard of this was, of course, America, which appears to be moving, at the moment anyway, towards a semi-caste system, with blacks and Hispanics as the lower caste, a vast underclass of people, and struggling middle classes either going up into the super rich or going down into the vast struggling masses. And so de facto huge differences of wealth, even if in theory it's from log cabin to White House and anyone can achieve, but it helps if you're born the son of an oil baron. Future historians therefore may see the premise of equality and some fairness of distribution to be only a short kind of period between, say, about 1800 and 2000, or they may see that the tide went back a bit and will come in again. In the next talk, I'll talk about exchange and gift.